Right, morning everybody.
Morning.
So I'm going to give a summary of rather a lot of field work. There's a lot of ground to cover, but the idea today is to summarise our excavations and then to present some new information from our recent excavations last year at Holme Cultram. And rather than starting at Abbey Town, we actually started at Wolsty Castle. Just see if my pointer is working, yes. So I think you all know the site of Wolsty Castle. It is an earthwork, a known site, a moated platform from the medieval period and a stronghold of the abbey. We did some geophysics here, and these are the geophysics results. You can see we found some anomalies to the north of the moated site, which we put some trenches across, and found evidence that these ditches were actually from the 13th and 14th centuries. The pottery evidence therefore backs up the idea that these outer ditches existed before the licence to crenellate Wolsty and to really redevelop the site as a fortification. On the actual platform, we found pretty good preservation of wall foundations. We found a beautifully cobbled yard surface, which was cleaned by about 20 children from Abbey Town Primary School, and they did a fantastic job. They found musket balls and pottery. And we also unexpectedly found some very well preserved medieval timbers. You can see there a large toe piece here. You can see some timber sheeting and a footplate. So this is interpreted as a bridge, but the bridge was put out of use and buried in clay and waterlogged. Unfortunately, we tried to get a Dendrochronology date for the bridge, but that failed because there were not enough rings and it didn't match the sequence. However, proving the existence of an early entrance was very good for us, and here, drawn by Marilyn Leach, is a very nice artist's impression of how we think these timber remains worked. You can see that a sort of sheeted box with the uprights have gone, but we have the toe piece and the cross piece and the sheeting. So on the edge of the moated platform, they built this structure to support a bridge as an early entrance onto the castle platform. Another highlight of that excavation was a horse. There it is. That's not my epitaph, by the way. That is actually fitting for this animal, because we've had some analysis done of the skeleton, which has shown that this was indeed a beast of burden. The spine was heavily fused and worn, more consistent with a carrying animal than a pulling animal. That fits with where we found the horse, because the horse was actually in a cut in the wall which had been robbed. And we had interpreted that as a demolition event. The castle was it was demolished and recycled, if you like, in the 17th century, in the mid-17th. And so this animal was probably used for actually carrying blocks away from the demolition site to a place where they could put the blocks onto carts and get them away for reuse. So all of that information allowed us to learn a great deal about the layout of Wolsty Castle. It's arranged in with an outer ranges of buildings around a central courtyard. Our bridge position is here. The moat actually yielded very little material, surprisingly, for a medieval moat, and the horse was buried here. As I said, there's a lot to cover. We've also done quite a lot of Walkover Survey on the Solway Plain, really starting from the point of the reference that the abbey had 21 salt pans between Angerton and Seville Coat in operation. So we walked the head of the marsh right around, looking for evidence of salt working. And many people here came and did that work as well, as with all of the work I'm presenting. We had some excellent days out on the Solway, and we recorded all of these features. Many of them are pools, banks, ditches, mounds of earth related to salt production, which are very hard to interpret. But the biggest surprise was the bridges. We were looking for evidence of connectivity in the landscape, because of course with that level of industry, material had to be transported. And here you have a surviving single span sandstone clapper bridge. And so we recorded this one. We began to think it may be medieval. And all of these red squares are sandstone clap bridges. So we found actually 2 surviving bridges, here and here, but also the sites of many others, where the slabs had been moved and concrete pipes inserted. Also on the other side there, we found more evidence of these sandstone bridges. There's an example of the other surviving one on the marsh itself, heavily overgrown, but the same principle. Large sandstone slabs brought onto the marsh, used for crossing ditches, cuts, gutters, and of course what that helps us to do then is to trace the history of the cutting of these ditches themselves, because they are spanned by medieval structures. And who else but the monastery would invest in that level of infrastructure in large dressed sandstone work? All of these features recorded in the field by our volunteers, these lovely drawings by Ian, who's in the room today. I presented these bridges at a Solway Heritage Forum, and Alistair Brock from Natural England was there, and afterwards he said, "Mark, I think we have one on Weddin." And I was very interested, and Alistair kindly took us out to see it, and this is what we saw. Now, Weddin is actually a very interesting site. It was the source of the peat for the salt evaporation. It's been an important fuel source. Weddin wood was used by the monastery. We have references to that. And so it was very exciting for us to find direct evidence of monastic activity on Weddin. But here in the wood, we found this. And so with a bit of cleaning off, which was great fun and a great day's work, we revealed this. Another identical 3-slab, single-span clap bridge. And there are some of the people who actually uncovered that feature. So to find something like that, to reveal it, and really that strengthens the case again that these are monastic features. You know, this heavy dressed sandstone blocks. Right now it just sits in a wood, apparently going nowhere. But this was put there to access one of the stints on Weddin, and to extract and take material back to the monastery. On to excavations. 2014 was the year of the cistern. We had a fantastic feature in this vaulted arched sandstone cistern. I'll come to the discovery of that. These are our trenches that I'm presenting today. This rather odd-shaped trench here is the 2014 campaign. The cistern is down here. But our aim was to establish primarily the arrangement of the refectory to the north in the cloister range to the south of the cloister. In plan here, we achieved that goal. Here you can see the line of the south wall of the refectory with a drain running away from it. Here you can see what was a heavily robbed wall. In fact, nothing was left. Very often at Abbey Town, when we say it's a wall, we say there was a wall, but all that's left is the hole in the ground where the wall was, because they've taken every bit of stone. So you have to trust us on this. This was a wall. So what we established was that the refectory here was east-west, with some modification. The kitchen then projected to the south, and we picked it up again here. But then far to the south, we found a totally new complex of buildings that we didn't know existed. Here you see a large cistern, click the corner of a building here, and a drain there. When you're looking at Cistercians, drains will always come up. They're famous for drains. I've called this the main drain 2014 because you'll see another drain later on. You can see it survives totally capped. This is the capped drain. Here is the entrance of the cistern. And here from the top of the vaulted cistern, the water is running away. All of this is available, or will be very soon, online in our written reports, where you can study in detail our beautiful drawings and sections and get back to us with any questions. But this was an opportunity for us to investigate what the Cistercians were famous for. This was early medieval, not early medieval, but it was medieval sanitation, and early in Cumbria to have flushing latrines. Here you're looking into what's often referred to as a latrine pit. So you have two outflows here from the latrine which was in the building above. The cistern was actually used to store water, and when full, the cistern could be opened, and that would flush away any material that had gone into the latrine pit. Actually, what we realised was when we took levels on, sorry to scan back, when we took levels on the bottom of this drain, it didn't appear to be flowing away from the cistern. And I had one of those moments of crisis where I thought, oh no, everything's running the other way. You know, it's filling the cistern. But actually that makes some sense. If you think about how a toilet works, it's full of water. The majority of material going into this latrine pit will be solids. Urine was collected and used in textiles and other things. So it makes sense. And of course, if solids solidify, they won't flush away. So actually this was a wet place, and it was deliberately wet. The water didn't all wash away. So that was quite an interesting discovery post-excavation when we checked all of the levels. Also in this season, we clipped a building. We knew that there was a building from this excavation to the south of the cistern, and the latrine and the cistern were serving a building. But in that season, that was all we managed to establish. Another excavation in the same year took us to Friars Gaff, here. You can see in the magnetometry results here, a heavy black anomaly, evidence of burning, high magnetism. Our trenches proved the geophysics to be right, and here you can see a sequence of iron smelting pits, evidence of industrial activity. It is monastic. We found medieval pottery there, and we went back to do another excavation, and we found a dump of material sealed by clay, and we found that actually this iron smelting and ore roasting activity took place next to a pond, an artificial pond or watercourse. So a lot of material had gone into there, which preserved a lot of leather artifacts. Here you can see some of the leather as it came out of the ground. You'll have a chance to see some of this leather conserved at lunchtime when we display the finds. 63% of the leather that we recovered was parts of shoes. There is a leather report again that you can read in detail, done by Tim Padley. The leather was worn, it wasn't cobbler's waste, it wasn't manufactured, but there was some evidence of recycling. In other words, taking cuts from worn leather shoes and using them for other purposes. So a very interesting assemblage for Cumbria, outside of Carlisle, for example, very rare. The dating of this is crucial because actually medieval pottery dating we could talk a great deal about, but it's very, very difficult here. It's not tight dating. The same types of pottery were used for quite long periods, and we don't know where all of the kilns were. So that can be quite vague. However, Tim Padley has dated the leather by type of shoe to the late 14th century, which is the best dating we have for that industrial activity. Also in that material we found a fantastic plough coulter. Of course, coulter, to cultivate, gives its name to Holme Cultram. Cistercians, of course, did quite a lot of land improvement, and you can also see this medieval plough at lunchtime. The coulter is this part here. It is the blade that cuts the soil, and the share behind then turns the soil. And here again, this is a coulter, very similar to the one we found, and the share here. So, fantastic evidence in a archaeological landscape research project to find the tools that the Cistercians brought here to actually work the soil. These deep ploughs actually revolutionised their ability to cut into the deep clays. The 2015 season, here's our trench, was to establish, first of all, the chapter house. The chapter house by form should be on the east side of the cloister. So trench 1 here was really just to establish the alignment of the east range, because it has been projected at all sorts of angles, actually probably because of this field boundary here. So some of the interpretive plans, the early plans, project the cloister to the east to not be at right angles to the Abbey Church. But in fact we found that it is, that boundary is a red herring. Here is what's left of the chapter house wall, and as you can see they left us one bit of the chapter house wall, the rest has been recycled. And the chapter house is in here, this is inside of the chapter house, totally robbed. We found also some graves here which we'll look at, there's a drain coming through here. And this here is the cloister walk. So this is the east cloister walk heading up to the church. There it is in plan. In the cloister walk we found 2 very well preserved grave slabs. This one we had previously seen on an earlier evaluation But we were able to confirm that it actually was the grave of a John de Newton. And when we talk about the de Newtons, we aren't talking about Newton Arlosh, and we're talking about West Newton. And here, a totally new one to us. This was laid Hic Jacet Domina Eoa de Newt. So here lies Lady Eoa. And we've not been able to trace her in the records, but again, a de Newton of the family at West Newton. We found some fantastic floor tiles. I kept thinking we're bound to find a mosaic tile surface at some point that they missed, but we never did. However, we do find really nice examples of medieval tiles. A full report has been produced by Dr. Jenny Stopford, and you'll be able to read that in the full reports. So you can see how we're building the picture of the monastery here. We've established the east range now. We have the south of the refectory. We're putting the kitchen in. And it's really helping us to piece together really how the monastery was arranged, how this one worked. Because in many ways they're a bit like Roman forts. You know, people will say, why bother digging a Roman fort? They're all the same. But it's in the differences that they are sometimes substantially different. Trench 2 in the same season, down here, we wanted to look at that building by the cistern. How could we resist? You know, we'd only seen the corner of it. And so many of you in this room are on that photograph. I don't know why I'm telling you this, you dug it. There's Billy, I think, and you can tell the time of year because you know Christmas is coming when you get turkeys in the trench. This was a wonderful building to excavate, very well preserved. There you can see it runs under the barn at the back. But for once at Abbey Town, for once, we had walls and they hadn't been robbed. And we think that's because this building actually stood beyond dissolution. It stands on top of quite a lot of archaeology. It's quite a late addition to the monastery. And there are references to, for example, the Sheriff of Allerdale being granted right to lie overnight to oversee demolition works at the Abbey. So there were buildings standing post-dissolution which were used. Exactly what our building was, we don't know. We thought perhaps Abbotts Lodging, perhaps infirmary, because you know the infirmary may be over there somewhere. If you look at the Abbotts Lodging here at Roche Abbey, it's quite similar in construct. It has the room at the end. I need to find out if that's a hearth in the middle. But we're just guessing. It could be any number of buildings. However, it had a central hearth to the south of the building. Here you can see it overlying an awful lot of archaeology, including early drain sequences. And that's what I say about it being a late building. It survived and stood beyond dissolution. But it was also built on top of a great big hole, which had been filled in. This hole here, you can see all of this material. This line of stones is the footing for probably a timber partition wall. But that has slumped because everything sits on top of a very deep hole, which is the first phase of activity on this site. Now, Linda Howard's in the audience, and for her benefit, I was going to tell you about the chronomid Sectrotampus. Linda has analysed the beetles, the insect remains from these deposits. You can see that they are very organic, and they're quite interesting. They tell us about waterlogged environments, and I just pulled this one out because this one to me stood out in that report because it requires a particular set of circumstances with a high pH level. And for example, on another site, it has been found associated with flaxworking and retting. We'll see. I haven't checked the other environmental samples yet. But that's the depth that we go to in the analysis, and again, the full insect reports are available. It was a luxury accommodation. It was very well appointed. It had a fireplace, as well as the open hearth. And of course, it was served by this very elaborate cistern with water supplies coming in from two positions, and here's the latrine in the corner of the room. So an Abbotts Lodging, possibly, guest accommodation, possibly, part of the infirmary. But the fact that it was a late building was backed up by the pottery, because here you can see some early post-medieval pottery, some imported stonewares, some Cistercian ware, which is actually post-medieval, very early post-medieval. We also found this object, actually Mick found this object there, an inscribed sun in splendour into sandstone. The sun in splendour is a heraldic symbol used very often in the medieval, loved by Edward IV, for example. But inside you can see what appeared to be a DN, which we did some research into. We found Dominus Noster is a known medieval abbreviation for our Lord. However, as a mould, you have to reverse it, and then it clearly becomes RC, which are the initials of the Abbot Robert Chambers from 1507 to 1518. So this was likely a mould to make some sort of badge or livery for during the time of Abbot Chambers, possibly a horse badge or brass. You can see that we can now add in our building at the bottom to our understanding of the arrangement at Holme Cultram. And we wanted to do a bit more geophysics. Geophysics is the way that we usually target sites. Here you can see, this is the vegetable garden. It's been a garden, an orchard for many years. And Reg gave us permission to go in there and have a look. Because obviously it's very close to our newly discovered building. And you can sort of see a line here, possibly a right angle, although these two turned out not to be walls. And so we had a look in there, and this is now onto last year's excavations, the 2016 season, which was a year of a very, very wet trench and a very nice dry trench. This is the dry one. Billy dug that in a day. You can see him there, Billy. This was the pleasant trench to work in, very well drained, even though the ground was wet. And that's trench 1 here, right in the middle of the vegetable garden. Very quickly we found that actually the archaeology was close to the surface in this trench, and we found these 3 large pots, which you can see in the exhibition at lunchtime. Very well preserved. They've been really just in the garden's been rotivated, so the tops of them have gone. And these pots we think are 16th century, possibly late sort of 1500s. Again showing that this area was used post-dissolution. We thought we had graves. They looked like graves. I went to bed absolutely convinced that that was a grave there, east-west aligned, cut into clay, almost exactly like we had in the cloister walk to the east of the cloister. A nice clay surface, body-shaped holes in it, east-west, and another one here. However, they weren't graves, and they weren't medieval. This is the best dating I've ever seen in a section in my life. Never happened before, but whilst half-sectioning this feature, a piece of pottery stuck in the edge, 1690. They were never graves. What we think they were are early robbing trenches, where they're trying to find stone to rob. Now, that's an interpretation. They're full of 17th and 18th century material. It's backfilled stuff from the blacksmiths over the road. And of course, what we very rarely find are early robbing trenches, because if they hit a wall, you never find the trench where they found the wall. But that is a reasonable interpretation for what these features are. They were having a look for some stone, they didn't find it, and they went elsewhere. Now, finally, we found the main drain. This, if you're going to dig a Roman site, you want a hypercaust. If you're going to dig a Cistercian site, this is the iconic Cistercian archaeology. There have been legends of treasure, there have been legends of tunnels from the church to the farm. We've heard all of these. This would make a very good tunnel, because when it was intact, you'd be able to stand up in it. We couldn't bottom it. You can see the sides here, nicely dressed sandstone, and you can see the amount of material that we had to take out, that Billy had to take out, to get down to the archaeology. And that's why we couldn't fully excavate it. It was too deep. To fully excavate that, we would have to step all of the sides, get machines back in. However, we could see it, and we saw it in this part of our trench, and you can see how impressive it is. You can see why there are legends of tunnels, because this must be intact under the farm, or the farm would have fallen down. I'll come back to that in a moment. And here, so you can see we have this beautiful wall. So we have another building, another range of buildings to add to our plan. Alongside the wall, you have this clay surface, and we found evidence of beams here. So what you have is a large wall with a clay walk with a cover, a bit like a cloister walk. There may be a second cloister here. We only have this evidence. And then a lot of our trench taken up by the backfill of the drain, the main drain here. And that raises some questions because we have a huge drain here. Where's the water source? It's actually pointing to the end of the tea room in alignment. So if it runs straight, it's going to run right up that way towards the moor and the hill. It may be tapping springs up there. We haven't got that far, but it's an example of how one trench can lead you to try and answer further research questions in the landscape. And this wall here aligns perfectly with this bit of wall here. And so this is a surviving piece of medieval wall. And that's why I say if this drain was robbed out here, that wall couldn't be there. So under the farm, the drain exists. Some ne'er-do-wells. Mill Grove. We wanted to have a look at Mill Grove. We believe the mill is under the barn. Makes it very difficult to dig. Farmers tend to not like us taking barns down. But we could do some geophysics near the barn. And here you can see in the lower field some resistance data. Not particularly interesting, a hint of a line here. But in the magnetometry, you can see a very strong line here and here. And a break in the line there. We decided to put a trench down there to have a look. What we were looking for was that either this could be a ditch, a defensive ditch, part of a moat, or perhaps the end of the mill race, the tail race of the mill running away. And our trench, our final trench is here, right down in the bottom, right down on the flat where it's very wet, very near the drains. Always risky, but we thought we'd give it a go. And here you can see the deposits that formed that black line to the east side of the trench. And we found that it's not a simple ditch, it's not a simple tail race, it's actually the edge of something much, much bigger than we could dig. You can see all of these deposits here are still going down. And this black material here, that's got a lot of medieval pottery in it, some finds, bone. So really, we'd clipped the edge of a channel, and what the magnetometers were seeing was the material on the edge of that channel. You can see that line here, it sort of came around like this. Very difficult digging, extremely difficult. In fact, one of the worst trenches I've ever dug, because this silt becomes like quicksand when it's mixed up with water. And Kevin, who was working in this trench as well, actually got stuck. And after laughing a lot, we realised he really was stuck. And we got him out. But horrible to work in. However, on the other side, we had something really unexpected. Now, bear in mind to start with, we were thinking mill, and we found this stonework right down on the bottom, right on what in Lincolnshire would be fenland. It's marshland, it's wet, covered in silt. Why on earth was there this beautiful wall, which wasn't actually at a right angle? So we pondered it, and as we have to, we press on. Very nice stonework, lovely dressed blocks. This block dressed not at 90 degrees, but to run away there, lovely facing on it. And eventually, we had to conclude it's a wharf, jetty, harbour, call it what you like, but this sits on the edge of that channel. And it projects into it. It has beautiful preserved medieval timbers associated with it, retaining it. It's a jetty, it's a wharf. Yeah. And that was extremely exciting because we have pondered, how do you get the stone up to the abbey? We were very fortunate that Glyn Kopak, an expert on Cistercians, came to site, and I put this theory to him, and ready to be like, no, it's not. And he absolutely agreed. He said in Lincolnshire, Cistercians were granted license to dig a canal wide enough for 2 ships to pass to serve monasteries. And so here we are, Holme Cultram, a total new light on that landscape. And furthermore, those timbers, we cut a sample here, and we finally got a Dendrochronology date. And that date, there was no sapwood on this sample, so we can't get the exact year of felling. However, there were 234 rings, and this tree started to grow in AD 902. But it was felled soon after 1167. Now, that tells us that this was in use in the early phase of the monastery, established 1150, of course. So that's really exciting. As an aside, but we all like nice finds, you can see how the wall here, the dressed stone ends and it becomes some large granite boulders which form part of a bank as it starts to head up what we call the Holme, the glacial mound that the abbey sits on. And right here we found this axe head, which is currently at Durham University undergoing conservation, but is intact. So a lovely find from Trench 2. Now, we're all about landscape here. We set out to be a landscape research project, and it's worth considering why on earth we have a harbour where it is now, because that was the leap. You're standing in a field, and to actually make the leap to say that here was any useful watercourse. But here, look, here is the abbey. Look, here are the watercourses now. You have Crummock Beck here, and you have the Waver here, meeting in this point. And so the only water supply currently running past Mill Grove is the outflow of the Stank being the body of water to the west at Abbey Town, which was really a tarn, effectively. And we have puzzled this, was there enough water coming from the Stank to drive a mill? It could be managed, you could use the Stank as your head of water. But while we were digging here, Reg from the bungalow took us out on a walk. We'll do anything to get out the trench sometimes, but to use his local knowledge, he wanted to show us a channel here that in times of flood heads towards his bungalow, which is here. The railway line ran like this. You can see part of the embankment here. And so the railway line actually bridged this channel here with an arched brick bridge. You can still see part of that. So it was significant enough in the building of the railway to put an arch over it. But now, it's not a channel anymore. And so we do some regressive mapping. Here's the Donald map of 1774. Accurate-ish, but very interesting when looking at the watercourses. Here you can see the Stank, now drained, and here's the Abbey. And here are the watercourses as they existed in 1774. Now, if I zoom in, you can see that same point of the Crummock Beck meeting the Waver, but they go north. And they meet the Stank outflow at the Abbey, which is here. So what seems to have happened, I've tried to rectify the Donald map onto the current map, which is a total waste of time, because it can't be done. But in parts it can. And so as an overlay, this is a clue that backs up what Reg was showing us. When the Crummock met the Waver, before the railway came, when they moved the beck to run parallel to the embankment, these two watercourses went north, they met the Stank outflow, and all of that water then would have been available to drive a mill. And all of that water would have been right here, in this channel, right alongside our wharf and harbour at Abbey Town. Now the Waver now, if you go to find it further to the south of our site, is very tidal. When we've worked alongside the Waver about 1 kilometre to the north, before it loops around, you can watch the tide running up, and it will bring up anything that's in the Waver. It comes up. Why wouldn't you use that to serve the monastery? Finds from the site have been very exciting. I won't go through them all. They're now illustrated. A beautiful pewter pilgrim badge there. Where's Jan? Where's it from, Jan? Boxley Abbey. Canterbury. Several examples of clothing clasps, book clasps, now illustrated. We found some fantastic window glass. Dr. Rachel Tyson has done some very interesting glass reports. The glass has been conserved at Durham University. And this is a sort of before and after shot of the glass as it's had a sort of quick clean out of the ground, and then after conservation. Some of the glass showed evidence of burning and was assessed, and it had seen high heat, which may be related to demolition or the robbing of the lead. But also the glass assessment showed that the majority of the material could be from one glazing campaign. So the glazing was done in one campaign. But as an example, which I find fascinating, what Dr. Rachel Tyson has done is to take some of our pieces of spires and compare them to other sites. And so here is an example of what the windows at Holme Cultram would have been like in this style. Another very exciting part of the chapter house excavations was the number of lead tokens that were found, largely by Alan, who's at the back with his metal detector, because they're very hard to spot in the ground. And they were also often churned around in the post-dissolution rubble and the robbing debris. But we found 43 of them by the chapter house. In previous excavations, we'd only found one. These tokens that have the word cell on the back have been the subject of a lot of discussion, and we think they relate to salt. But other tokens showing evidence of metalworking with animals, stags on. And these have now been the subject of a dissertation by Kate Rennicks, and as a type series in the north of England, of course they're unique, and to find so many on a site like this in the north of England is unique. And so they're really telling us about the use of tokens in medieval trade and monastic sites. So Kate is actually presenting these at the first ever conference on lead tokens in Warwick University in June or July. Google it, you can go. 3 days of lead tokens. But there is a drinks reception. No, I was joking with Kate about it because she's very excited. You know, she did her thesis on this, and it is pretty groundbreaking stuff. So there's a lot more to learn about these, and we need to share these with other sites and compare more widely. We found a lot of coins. Alan found a lot of coins. The coin report is currently being written by John Mattinson, so I don't have any more detail. Apart from, to my eye, all the Edwards look the same. There are details to tell them apart in the curl and so on, and I've tried. I can tell you that this is a London mint, because you can see Civitas London. But coins give us a lot of information. They're not always the most useful in dating, because of course they kick around for quite a long time. But as an assemblage, when we take the coins and we take the tokens, of course what the monastery is doing, it has a closed economy largely with the use of its own issues of tokens. But ultimately they can transfer those goods for real hard cash. And there was certainly a fair bit of that kicking around. That's a tiny coin, that's a farthing. Did you get that with a detector? Yeah, it's absolutely tiny. The environmental material has also been yielding some useful information. Dr. Brian Irving, who I saw this morning, but he's gone. Many of you in this room have spent hours picking out fish bones from gravel. It can be quite therapeutic, but what we start to then piece together is actually a list of the species that the monastery were utilising. And that tells us some interesting things in that, at the bottom here, you see that they were using a freshwater resource. They were eating carp and roach and rudd. We've debated a lot about whether the abbey actually had fish ponds and whether they were using the stank for that purpose. What this information tells us is that they were practicing aquaculture here. It doesn't prove where the ponds were. There are several candidates for the site of a pond. It may be the stank. But as Brian concludes his research, what we have built up there is a picture of the resource of food, the marine and the freshwater resource that Holme Cultram was utilising. The mammal bones, 135 kilos of mammal bone you've picked up. Don hasn't finished his report, but it is a significant assemblage. We were talking about it being actually internationally significant in terms of the amount of material. It's still being assessed, but there is a diversity of bird bones, for example. There are also 2 whale bones, and I really like the idea of monks tucking into a whale. And we've also evidence that these bones were being deliberately broken to render fat and grease. So there were processes going on. These bones weren't only just being used as joints of meat. There were other processes like the rendering of fat. Majority was cattle. There were sheep and pigs there, but the majority of bones we found were cattle bones. occasional cat and dog, but probably these were pets. I don't think they were eating those. And red deer bones. There are references to the monastery getting into a bit of bother for poaching, taking wood illegally in Inglewood Forest. There are also references to them complaining about the woodland around Holme Cultram, around the home, that basically was a corridor which encouraged deer to come into the farmland of the home, and the deer was seen as something of a pest. But for us, we have a fair bit of evidence that they were utilising wild species. The plant remains. Again, we have our first report. The main thing that stands out for me, what I'm summarising are very detailed reports that are not my specialism, but it's the prevalence of oats as a cereal crop here. It's not that unusual. I mean, we've seen the plough culture actually in damp climates, in hard soils. Oats are the crop of choice, and they were used for porridge, horse fodder, also for producing ale. So oats were the preferred cereal by far in the assemblages we've seen. And the only exotic we have is a single grapeseed. And I like to think that Robert Chambers ate it in front of everybody else. And that kind of concludes my talk. Apart from to just show you some pictures of the many people who gave so much time over the last 4 years to do this work. It wasn't me. It was many of you in this room, many people who aren't here. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I will leave you with an image of the cake brought to site by Arthur on our last dig last year. Thank you very much.